Welcome to our newest edition of Ask a Futurist. We're excited here to have author Bob Johansen to talk about his new book, and I'm sure that all of you are as well and be able to ask him questions about it. So just to kick things off, I wanted to share a little bit more about Institute for the Future, who's hosting this. So we're a 52-year-old nonprofit organization that helps organizations, communities, and individuals think systematically about the future. And Ask a Futurist is a series of online conversations that we co-host with a number of different IFTF researchers, basically to allow folks like you who are out in the field and are both doing futures as maybe your core work or incorporating foresight as part of your daily work, and really an opportunity for you to be able to ask them questions and they can draw upon their years of research and experience. This series is sponsored by IFTF Vantage, which is our organizational partnership program. IFTF Vantage offers research-based perspectives, a collaborative digital platform known as Vantage Point for our community, as well as customized coaching. Our annual conference, the 10-Year Forecast Summit, is an opportunity to experience futures based on the forecast that we are developing. And excitedly, we are excitedly sharing about Future Factors, our new signals platform that allows our partners to be able to scan for signals and collect those as well. Our partnership helps organizations transform urgent foresight into actionable insight. And you're certainly going to hear about some of the ways in which that happens today as Bob answers your questions. So in case you're not familiar with Zoom, although I think many of us are far more familiar with it now than we were before, many of you are already introducing yourselves in chat. If you have not already, please continue to do so. All of you should see a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Or sort of on your screen that allows you to submit questions as we are having a conversation. Of course, many of you submitted questions before, so we're going to start with those, but as we're going along and you have an additional question you'd like to ask, please feel free to add that to the Q&A section. You can also upvote questions that other people are submitting as well. I think you'll also notice that everyone's already muted with your video turned off. So again, use the Q&A to ask questions, but please, if there are other resources that you would like to share, you can also share that in chat so that all of us can benefit from those as well. And so with that, I want to introduce you to Bob Johansen. Again, yes, this will be available online later. You'll get the email recap, and it's also posted publicly for you to share with others. So excited to have IFTF Distinguished Fellow, several times over author Bob Johansen join us this morning to discuss his book, Full Spectrum Thinking. Bob is going to share a bit of a summary about the book and the sort of overall arc of what he's been writing about over the years, and then we will get into a Q&A conversation with questions from all of you.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, whatever time it is as you're joining me. I'm inviting you into my study here in San Mateo, California, Silicon Valley. You'll see I'm an author. I write books, and I love to have books all around me. So, I write ebooks. I recorded my own audiobook this time, but I still love physical books, and just having the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves around me gives me a kind of grounding as I think long-term. But you also notice I've got my exercise equipment right in the study, so I can kind of mix my writing and my effort to stay healthy. So I'm going to share some core slides that tell the story of full spectrum thinking. The book was officially released this week, so this is the book launch webinar, which I had planned to do in person. My last physical trip was February 27, and obviously things have changed. So this is a virtual book tour, and you're a piece of it. And I'm going to share the core story of the book, and then we'll open it to conversation. So just to share my screen and then to begin the story, I've realized, that's interesting. So I've realized that this is the core question that I've been focusing on for the last 10 years. And I didn't realize when I started that journey that I was in the process of writing 3 books together. And now I've finished the third, and I've realized that it is a trilogy, and it's organized around these questions: the mindset, the literacies, and the skills that it will take to thrive in the next decade. 1 mindset, full spectrum thinking; 5 literacies, and many of you have read the book, The New Leadership Literacies; and 10 skills, which go back to the book I did called Leaders Make the Future. So today we're going to talk about the mindset that's going to be needed to thrive. This is the new book, officially released on April 27, but my publisher, Barrett Kohler, rushed it out because it's so relevant to the current mood. It builds directly on the new leadership literacies, which are practices or disciplines that are needed to thrive in this world. It's what the Army War College calls the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it ties together with the 10 skills that I talked about in the 2 editions of Leaders Make the Future. So they all thread together, but today we're going to talk about mindset. Full spectrum thinking is the ability to seek clarity. And a lot of this conversation is about clarity. Clarity is a key skill. Clarity links to all the literacies, and clarity is basic to full spectrum thinking. So we need the ability to seek clarity across gradients of possibility while resisting the temptations of certainty. So this is a balancing, a very delicate balancing, a very challenging balancing of clarity versus certainty. We need to develop our clarity through full spectrum thinking, but moderate our certainty. So the medical community is already on this. We often quote William Gibson: the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Well, to my surprise, as I was writing the book, I realized that the medical community has already moved from labeling or categorizing someone as autistic, which often was a kind of end of the road judgment to kind of write them off as autistic, to now thinking of the autism spectrum disorders. And I was really delighted to learn that in 2019, Kaylin Bennett from Louisiana became the first person on the autism spectrum to receive a full basketball scholarship to play at a Division I school, Kent State. To me, this was such an important signal, an indicator of what's to come. So we can't make sense of the future with the categories of the past. Just like autism, labeling someone as autistic just doesn't make sense when you see the spectrum of opportunities, the spectrum of experiences that people have on the autism spectrum. So that's what we need to apply now as we think about the future. And here's how I think about it, and I talk about this in the new book. We now do a focus on the present, the now, then we think about what's next, and then we think about the future. And for many organizations and many companies, they never quite get to the future part. They focus on the now, and that's where they should focus. They then have their second level effort on next, and they kind of rarely get to the future. It's what traditionally we've thought of as present forward strategy, or in the strategy world, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. Now, this works perfectly well in a predictable, linear, relatively stable world. We are not in that kind of world anymore. What we need now is a now future next, or a future back view. And I like the horizons, but instead of doing Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, do Horizon 1, Horizon 3, and then come back to Horizon 2. And, I'm often asked as a 10-year forecaster, I've focused my life 10 years ahead for the last 30 plus years. I'm often asked, how can you do 10-year forecasting, Bob? I can't even do 1 or 2. Well, the reason is because it's easier. It's actually easier to look long. The present is so noisy, particularly today. The present is so noisy, it's just very hard to get a clear view where we're going. So this is the basic model we use at the Institute: foresight, insight, action. And this is a process of seeking clarity. This is a process of resisting certainty. And this is the model we use and we found so powerful. It always begins with hindsight, your pre-virus stories of the past, present, and the future. And in writing this book, I've spent a lot of time with neuroscientists, and what they tell us is that our brains have this personal neural story net that we all have. And some of our story nets are more open than others. And what we're trying to do as futurists is to break in to that personal neural story net with foresight. And the foresight's not a prediction, it's a story from the future, plausible, internally consistent, provocative, with signals to bring it to life. And the purpose of that foresight is to provoke your insight. So it's really our foresight as external voices, and there's many of them, and you use that foresight to provoke your insight. And an insight is an aha that creates a new story, a new clarity in your brain. And once you've had an insight, you can't go back. You can't unsee an insight. And it's really important to realize that foresight is not a prediction, it's a provocation. And some of the best foresight is the foresight you don't like. Our colleague Jaime Cascio likes to say, the best forecast is one that's usefully wrong. And it might be a forecast you don't want to happen. And the criteria is not that it happens, but that it doesn't happen. And ultimately, the way we get evaluated is, does the foresight provoke your insight that leads to your action? And the kind of action you look for, the kind of strategy you look for in a highly uncertain VUCA world, a post-virus world, is be very clear where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. So this is the essence of what we do. And, I first wrote about this in the book Get There Early, but we've refined this over the last 20 years now, and it's built into everything we do at the Institute. It's all about seeking clarity. This is the latest version of it. I'm happy to share the slide with any of you afterwards. So here's the big conclusion from the current book, The New Leadership Literacies, and Full Spectrum Thinking builds on this. This is a forecast, even in the VUCA world, I'm sure this is true. The future will reward clarity, but punish certainty. Many are certain, but few are clear. Now, I focus my life 10 years ahead. I'm not an expert in the present. I don't talk about politics. But just look around you in this crisis and ask yourself, who's clear and who is certain? Look for the clarity seekers. Avoid those stuck in certainty. Certainty is so dangerous now. Certainty is so brittle now. Certainty is so inflexible now. And clarity is just so different from certainty. And again, we've got a really strong neuroscience base to document this. So I'm just sharing one quote with you of many. This is from Robert Burton's work, the neuroscientist. And what he found in a controlled laboratory setting using fMRIs, despite how certainty feels, it is neither a conscious choice nor even a thought process. Certainty in similar states of, they call it knowing we know. That's what the neuroscientists call certainty. Similar states of knowing we know, they arise out of involuntary brain mechanisms that, like love and anger, function independently of reason. I had Robert Burton do an endorsement blurb. I asked him to do it, and he was glad to do it. And here's what he said about the Full Spectrum Thinking book. Thinking in categories can be personally restrictive and socially dangerous. So seek clarity, avoid certainty. So let's talk a bit about this link to stories because it's so essential. And that's where I want to end the conversation. And I invite you now to start asking your questions. I know we have some already. Here's my summary take about how to develop your clarity, but moderate your very present that we're living in. Clarity is expressed in stories. Certainty is expressed in rules or absolutes. So if you find somebody, if you absolutely a lot, be careful. Be careful. There's little to be absolute about in these times. Clarity includes questions. Certainty is about answers. Clarity includes stories that show curiosity and courage about other points of view. Certainty has very little curiosity. Clarity includes self-effacing stories about what you don't know. So look for people who are strong but humble. Strong but humble. It's the skill I call quiet transparency. That's what's going to be rewarded in this future. Certainty doesn't care what it doesn't know and doesn't care to know. So the playwright Aaron Sorkin, who's one of my favorites, just before the shutdown, I got to see his version of To Kill a Mockingbird on Broadway and see it as Jeff Daniels was in his last week of performing. And what Aaron Sorkin says is a good story. How do you create a good story, he was asked. And he said, I worship at the altar of intention and obstacle. So every great story is that tension between intention and obstacle, that dilemma. That's what makes a good story. So as you're thinking about what stories to tell about the virus, what scenarios to write about post-virus, think about that tension between intention and obstacle. Think about how a story can express clarity, but not get stuck in certainty. So again, I'm happy to give you these slides. And here's how I want to close. This is from research that was funded by DARPA to try to understand the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, funded by DARPA, to try to understand why in Afghanistan, the Taliban stories were working much better than the American stories. And quite to my surprise, I started teaching at the Army War College right after 9/11. And I've been promoted. I now get to teach the new 3-star generals in their first week in Washington, 5 at a time. And they read my books and we have this conversation about certainty versus clarity, about stories. And it's been a life-changing experience for me. And this finding is so important. And this is how I want to close the conversation this morning. Full spectrum thinking requires us to seek clarity, but resist certainty. Full spectrum thinking requires us to tell stories about the future, to create scenarios about the future that draw us into that future with clarity, but not certainty. And we have to make up the stories. We have to tell the stories. We have to spread the stories. That's our responsibility as futurists and as leaders. And if our brains don't hear stories, they make them up. They make them up. So let's make up some good stories. Let's make up some full spectrum thinking stories. Let's make up some stories of clarity, not stories of certainty, that help us engage, help us make the world a better place. So I'm going to stop the share here and go back to the conversation. Vanessa.
Thank you, Bob. That was an excellent summary of your book, and we have a lot of questions that have come in as you were sharing more about it. But I wanted to start with one question that I'm sure is top of mind, given what we are all living through right now, which is, of course, thinking about coronavirus, COVID-19, and this current crisis. And we've gotten a couple of questions around how does full spectrum thinking help us to maybe anticipate crises like the one that we are all living through right now? And how could we think about using full spectrum thinking to anticipate future crises
right.
like those?
Right. So the answer is it can help a lot. And there's really good news here. Um, Full spectrum thinking um, is a way to get beyond the tendency our brains have to categorize old experiences and use those categories to help us define what the future is going to be. And that just doesn't work as well in the VUCA world, in the post-virus world. By looking long and then working back, you can get a more clear idea where you're going. And the good news, the really great news, is over the next decade, the tools of full spectrum thinking are going to get so much better. And I mean tools like big data analytics, big data visualization, gameful engagement, artificial intelligence, machine learning, neuroscience. We've got so many new tools to help us be full spectrum thinkers. So if you start by looking future back and then come up with a full spectrum view of where we're going and work backwards. So again, seek clarity, resist certainty. So just to apply directly to the virus, look back at Bill Gates's writing from 10 years ago, from 5 years ago, and from today. Bill Gates has expressed great clarity about where we were going. He gave us a very clear warning in a full spectrum way 5 years ago, but few people listened to him. He's still looking that 10 years out. So to me, I find Bill Gates a source of clarity for me, trying to make sense of what's going on. So ask yourself, who in this crisis are voices of clarity? I think Anthony Fauci is a voice of clarity. I think Deborah Birx is a voice of clarity. I think the work coming out of Johns Hopkins is a voice of clarity. So there are voices of clarity out there. And what I'm bringing to the conversation is think future back, resist categorizing the future by the categories of the past, and think in a full spectrum way, and use these new tools to try to make sense of what's going on.
Yes. And to that point, we've gotten a question that is really thinking about kind of the opposite of maybe some of what we've been seeing. Some of the world turning inward, becoming more ethnocentric, inward focus. And so how can we think about engaging people who are not ready to embrace that kind of change and embrace the sort of ambiguity and that are really clinging to certainty?
Yeah, this is such a good question and such a troubling question. If you think about the current situation we're in, it's so noisy. It's so noisy, and it's not clear what's next. And this is clearly a VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And our brains don't like it. Our brains don't like it. So David Rock, the neuroscientist, the founder of the Neuroleadership Institute, I'm going to be on his podcast May the 1st, on his Brains at Work podcast. He has this wonderful model called SCARF for status, clarity, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And what he says is our brains are always processing that, the SCARF, and we got to keep them in balance. So in a crisis like this, our status is often challenged. Our certainty is obviously challenged. Our autonomy is challenged. Our relatedness is challenged. And it's not fair. It's affecting African-American people much worse than white people. It's affecting poor people much worse than less poor people. It's not fair. It's not fair. And it's very hard to process. So our brains are saying, go for certainty, seek out certainty. There isn't certainty. So we need somehow to work with people who have that very natural tendency to look for certainty and help them find clarity, but also help them resist certainty. And it's very tough. I'm not saying this is easy. It's a dilemma. It's the leadership skill I call dilemma flipping. You want to accept that you can't solve this, but engage with people to help make it better.
Great. And I think it's that question of engagement, like, definitely is coming up as people are thinking about their work and their, how they're networked across organizations and in their communities. So one in particular is really thinking about full spectrum thinking and movement building. So how can we use that to catalyze responses to big global issues like food insecurity? I would think certainly climate disruption falls in this as well.
Right.
So how can we do that flip really at scale?
Right. Yeah. So that's the big challenge. When I think some of you know, I went to divinity school, and I went to the divinity school Martin Luther King went to, and I was there when Dr. King was killed, and that ended up changing my life. And what I learned when I was in divinity school, I learned about a community organizer named Saul Alinsky from Chicago, who was one of the great community organizers of his time and kind of showed us how to bring communities together and build communities and create change. What we need now is the Saul Alinsky of cyberspace. And, Howard Rheingold referred to this as smart mobs.
Mhm.
And smart mob organizing is one of the 10 future leadership skills. I think we need people who, first of all, use that full spectrum thinking to come up with a clarity in the face of all this uncertainty, come up with a clarity, and then do smart mob organizing around how to make that happen. The good news is there's great tools to do this now, so much better than Saul Alinsky had. And that's why I've been doing 10-year forecasting a long time. This is the most frightening 10-year forecast I've ever been involved in, and it's the most hopeful. And one of the reasons I'm so hopeful is because of young people. We define the true digital natives as 24 or less. And Toshi Hu in our group has been talking about the XR natives now, who might be 13 to 15 now, the kids that got the Oculus Quest for a holiday gift. The digital natives and the XR natives, they're coming in with an ability to seek clarity, to see things in a full spectrum way. And they have the ability to change the world if they have hope. So if you look at the Parkland kids, in the post-shooting, how quickly they organized for gun control. Now, it's a tough fight, and they haven't gone nearly as far as they'd like. Look at Greta Thunberg. Nobody knew who she was a couple years ago, and she's become a global phenomenon who has had an impact. So I'm really optimistic about young people having the ability to come in with a conscience around things like global climate disruption, with a conscience around things like gun control, and with an ability to do smart mob organizing. So I'm really optimistic about that. But again, it comes back to hope. The challenge for each of us as leaders is to seed that hope and to nurture that hope and to help that hope grow.
Yes, and I think that we could all certainly use more hope these days. We've gotten a few questions that are really related to what are some of the elements that you see in successful stories where people are able to build that kind of hope and share that kind of hope, and how can we think about?
Yeah, great question. I went to divinity school, as I said, and I kind of grew up. I'm not an advocate of any brand of religion. I've always been more interested in Eastern religions than Western religions, and I've always been attracted to stories, mythic stories. So Joseph Campbell was very influential to me, and his understanding of storytelling in mythic traditions, like the hero's journey, for example. And by myth, I don't mean things that aren't true. That's kind of the modern misunderstanding. By myth, I mean stories that are a source of truth. Mm-hmm. Stories that are a source of truth. And I go there to find the elements of a good story. So look at the hero's journey. Just Google hero's journey. You'll see really interesting archetypal models of effective stories. The study I mentioned to you, the one that brought together, this is funded by DARPA, about why the Taliban stories were working. That was a case where in the project, they brought together master storytellers. I've gotten to meet a few of them, and neuroscientists. And they had the master storytellers tell people stories while their brains were being scanned in fMRIs. And that's how they concluded that our brains are wired for stories. And if they don't hear stories, they make them up. Now, that's not new. I learned that in divinity school. And anybody who's studied world religions knows that. What's new is now we have data. We have data to prove that. So why don't we use it? So go back to that study. What they found is the reason the Taliban study or Taliban stories worked, and this links to Hero's Journey, but it's new. What they say is there's got to be a person in the story that you can empathize with deeply. Doesn't have to be the hero or the heroine, but there's got to be empathy and that ability to feel really connected. The second thing is something bad has to happen to that person in the story. They tested something good and something bad. Something bad's much more powerful than having something good happen to it. The third thing that has to happen then is there has to be some relief that happens that essentially means, in most stories, somebody to blame. So in the Taliban stories, you always blame the Americans. And then the fourth element of a great story is there has to be something that people can do, some action that comes out of it. And again, in the Taliban stories, which were very simple but very powerful, it was join the Taliban or at least be friendly with them. So think about that as you're thinking about telling great stories of clarity. You need intense empathy. You need something bad to happen, and that's not hard to find. You need a response as part of the story. And it doesn't have to be somebody to blame, but it's at least got to be an explanation that's convincing. And then there's got to be some action out of it. And then go back to the Aaron Sorkin quote. There has to be an intention built in. And to me, intention is the same as clarity. There has to be a clarity or intention built in, and there has to be an obstacle. That's the something bad that happens. But those are the elements of great stories.
Yeah, that's interesting that something bad has to happen. I was really hoping for,
I always puzzled about that too. But you can see it, and in a way, it's just it's more biting in a way, or more engaging, that pulls people into the story. And if you think of the hero's journey, you remember there's always something, life's pretty good. And then there's this dramatic challenge and the hero falls off the map and everything is awful. And then there's a gradual recovery. But there's always this life-changing threat or challenge that the hero resists at first and then gradually yields to. And it ends up being transformational.
Yes, all looking for transformation through the challenges. Let's see. So speaking of stories, also grounded in facts, we have a couple of questions about this first piece about hindsight. So I know someone here has submitted a question saying, with their work, they go back to 1968 because that was such a transformational year in terms of politics and technology. And so now, given coronavirus, now, of course, there's a lot of conversation about the 1918 flu pandemic and what we can learn going backwards. And so what do you see in terms of, as we, maybe our hindsight time horizon, like what's the value maybe either going back farther? And how do you explain to people, using hindsight to learn about what to do towards the future?
Wow, such a nice question. Thank you. So our general rule of thumb at the Institute is we like 10 years out. We find that to be a sweet spot because it's beyond people's normal planning horizon, but close enough in to be believable. So our normal rule of thumb is go 10 years ahead. And when we go 10 years ahead, we go about 50 years back in most studies. So it's about a 60-year time swath. Because the big insight here is that almost nothing happens that's truly new. Almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So you're really asking in a 10-year forecast, not what's new, because if it truly is new, it's almost certainly not going to happen. But ask yourself instead, what's ready to take off? think in 60 years. Now, our colleague here, Rod Falcon, and also Brad Crite, they did a study back a few years ago on green health. And I was so impressed with what they did. They actually went 200 years back because the idea of green health was not new at all. We've had green health so far back in history. So they actually went 10 years ahead and 200 years back, a 210-year time swath. We did a project then for Syngenta before it was acquired by ChemChina. And in that case, again, I was working with Brad, and we were asked to do a 10-year forecast on food security, but we found 10 years wasn't enough to go ahead because people were so polarized around GMO foods in particular. And for a lot of people, they had certainty around GMO foods. They were sure they were wrong, not clarity. And the tricky thing about GMO foods is it's really a subject of food chemistry. It's not a yes-no choice. There's some good food chemistry, there's some bad food chemistry. And if you want to think about food security 10 years ahead, you have to think about food chemistry. So we had to get out of the certainty trap around GMO foods. So what we ended up doing in that study was going 30 years ahead. And that was where Brad and I found the right voice. And Lynn Jeffrey she leads our program in Foresight Essentials. Lynn likes to say that foresight helps you in kind of depolarize and engage in a conversation you couldn't have in the present. So in that Syngenta study, we went 30 years out. So to get back to the core question you're asking is, you've got to decide how far out to go to have the useful future back conversation. And for us, it's usually 10, but it might be more, might be less, but very rarely less than 10. And then you ask, how far do you have to go back to look for the patterns that are relevant? But that's my take on that. There's no one right answer about that, but you have to figure out how far in the future, how far back to create the right conversation that you want to start.
Perfect. And then we have a question actually on that same sort of right conversation vein. Like, how can we get people to move through the anxiety of, one is in hindsight, overcoming mistakes that might have happened before in the past, so that they're not either carrying them into the future or feeling guilty about those past mistakes. And then I have a sort of second follow-up question that as we look out into the future, how can we get people to sort of overcome the anxiety of committing to what course of action that they want to have in light of the sort of uncomfortableness of ambiguity and not having certainty?
Yeah. So it really is uncomfortable. I think that's the beginning. This is uncomfortable. I mean, I've been involved in writing scenarios about pandemics for years, so it's not a new concept to me. But still, I feel it personally, and all of us feel it personally. So this really isn't easy. I think foresight, and in particular, gameful engagement as a form of foresight, the literacy I call voluntary fear engagement. So in the military, that's why they do wargaming, to immerse yourself in that kind of future and to practice in lower risk ways. So you're more prepared to engage in that uncertainty. And I got to visit the National Training Center, which was the Army's National Training Center in the Mojave Desert. And it's, I came to think of it as the world's largest video gaming parlor. It's about the size of the state of Rhode Island. It has real tanks, real actors. It has real helicopters. And they play a game for 2 weeks, 24 hours a day. It's voluntary fear engagement. Many people are killed without having to die. That's very instructive. So I got to go out on the battlefield and interview the virtually dead. And what they told me was that their experience at Fort Irwin at the National Training Center, their experience was actually harder than real warfare. So they got to practice in lower risk ways. And I think that's our challenge, and that's the value of foresight to start a good conversation, is we've got to figure out a way to immerse ourselves in the future. Now, scenario planning does that. That's what a good story does that. Often workshops do that. You can do this. It's hard. And you've got to figure out a way to confront the anxiety, confront the fear, immerse yourself in the fear in a way that you're not going to get hurt. And our brains are going to struggle with that, but you got to do it in such a way that our bodies aren't going to get hurt either. And it's a very tough time in that regard. But I think this is where foresight becomes particularly valuable. This is where scenario planning becomes particularly valuable. And, we've got a team at the Institute working on post-COVID scenario resources. We're doing scenarios, but we're also helping other people do their own scenarios to immerse themselves in that fear and come out the other side.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about being at the Institute is that we have like those kinds of experiences, like those immersions and scenarios, as well as experiences like our 10-year forecast summit, where people can come and be immersed. Right. Like last year we did the simulation and thinking about the sort of different views of the world and what automation and how that was going to change the world that we live in.
Right, and the challenge for us is now we don't know when we're going to be able to do that in person again. Now, if you think back, though, in 2009, our colleague Jane McGonigal and Kathy Vian, they created a global online massive multiplayer game called Superstruct, which did engage people in the future. And one of those scenarios, one of those urgent futures was a pandemic. So you can do it. And the tools for vividly immersing ourselves in the future, the tools are getting so much better. You can criticize Zoom, but, I started using video conferencing in the 70s, and this is so much better, so much better than what we used to have.
Yes, indubitably so. And on that vein, I think we've had a few people asking just kind of about like virtual reality and like what that could offer us, and this sort of speaking to immersion and where you see that as an opportunity to engage people.
So I'm really excited about it. Our colleague Toshi, who I mentioned earlier, he's my teacher on a lot of this. But the way I think about virtual reality is those fully immersive virtual reality tools. They're really interesting and will be very relevant for specialized cases. I'm more interested in what's starting to be called XR or cross reality. I like to use the term blended reality. And the way I see it 10 years ahead, we're going to have much more graceful interfaces to the world outside. We'll always be online unless we're off. And the interfaces might be through glasses, might be through bone conducting, audio. We don't know quite what the interfaces are going to be like, but we know they're going to be a lot better than these kind of crude iPhones or the kind of devices we carry now, the tablets, the laptops. They're great compared to what we used to have, but they're not at all as good as we're going to have 10 years from now. So we're all going to be in this blended reality world. In our work on the future of advertising and the future of commerce, we've often used the term fusion commerce. Won't make any sense to say online or in-store shopping. It's always going to be a blend. And that's the world we're moving into, is a blended reality world. So I think, in my earlier books, I argued that 2010 was a threshold year because of the iPad and the iPhone creating a media ecology. So if you were a young person starting to become an adult, which usually happens between 13 and 15, depending on the kid and depending on the culture, if you are a young person trying to become an adult, you're just going to be different. That's the 2010 threshold. I think that this is going to be a new threshold now, a new threshold in 2020 because of things like the Oculus Quest. But it turns out it isn't just the Oculus Quest anymore. It's the Oculus Quest meets the COVID-19 crisis. So I think that increases the likelihood that 2020 will be a threshold year. And the kids who grew up with homeschooling during the crisis, the kids who got the quest for a holiday gift, the kids who grow up thinking they can reach out to anybody globally, those kids are going to change the world if they have hope.
Yes, and speaking of kids and homeschooling, we, of course, across the world, there is a massive scale up of online learning. And of course, again, you know, online learning isn't new, but I do think that there's some new considerations given both the scale of it as well as how many skills that maybe we need to talk about. So how do we need to rethink education, especially higher education, in light of this threshold year kids that are going to be coming out of this?
Right.
What sort of new skills do they need to have for the future, and how do we see their entry into adulthood in the workplace shifting as a result of those changes and how they
Right.
now learn?
But again, very interesting, and we've actually got some pros in the group online here that I wish I could call on now. But we did a custom forecast about a year ago now for Southern New Hampshire University. Paul LeBlanc is their leader, and what we found there, we did a forecast looking at the college student of the year 2030, so 10 years from now. And the great news is the learning resources are unprecedented. The learning resources are incredible. And just look at how SNHU offers now quite an inexpensive, very high quality college degree. And it's a mix of in-person and online, which obviously the mix is going to be changing now. But the opportunities, I think, for learning, the opportunities for education are just getting dramatically better. There's certain things, though, that are really scary. We can't do student loan debt the way we're doing it. It's just not sustainable. And we're not sure what's the value of a college degree in the gig work economy, in the kind of post-virus economy. We're not sure what's the value of an undergraduate degree. We're not sure what's the value of a graduate degree. So the next decade is kind of a decade of truth for the value of college degrees. And I think those institutions that can't make the case are going to fall by the wayside. And those that can make the case are going to be elevated in importance. And the models in between, the Khan University kind of models or the Coursera kind of models are I think the prototypes for how that's going to play out in a long term and how it's going to scale. So I'm really optimistic because the learning resources are so strong. But I'm also concerned because student loan debt is not sustainable. And the value of a college degree is not obvious. So we're going to have to renegotiate the terms of that.
Wow. Renegotiate the terms of higher education.
You should say, for those of you who haven't been on the Southern New Hampshire University website lately, our forecast is kind of summarized with their views on the future too. And it's a really good source around this. And the Institute's also done several other really interesting studies over the last years. And Maureen, maybe we can link those in the follow-ups too for people who want more detail.
Thank you, Bob. And so let's see. I think to kind of bring back two stories, I know that, we're talking about higher education and definitely in American context, because I think student loan debt is a uniquely American burden to be shouldered.
I should have said that.
But as we look out across the globe, so more non-Western countries, sort of non-G8 countries, what about their visions for the future? Like where are there opportunities for them to participate and share alternatives to maybe what might be more market dominated visions of that? And how might the fundamental nature of how they tell stories and what stories they're sharing change the future of that?
So this varies a lot. And we just finished a study in the last year that, again, we can put a link in about youth in thinking globally, 6 different countries, and the attitudes, the resources, the stories. And you're right, it varies dramatically. One of the things I was really impressed with about Southern New Hampshire University is they actually have a program to offer college degrees for refugees and immigrants. It's based in Africa. So there are interesting models coming about for that. But it's really a challenge, and it varies a lot depending on what part of the world you're in. I do think the stories vary from culture to culture and from situation to situation. But I also believe there are underlying archetypes of storytelling that are built in. Dylan Hendricks is one of the leaders of our 10-year forecast, and he's kind of schooled in the art of mythic thinking and storytelling and the link to colors and the link to stories more widely. And some of his work and some of the earlier Vantage work actually links to that importance of stories, of mythic thinking, and even of colors. Dylan did this really nice thing on colors and the kind of map of the role of color. Your opening slide was this beautiful purple, because Dylan finds that's the color of the future, more or less. It kind of attracts you to that fused thinking about the future. So, but thank you for mentioning it. Our forecasts are inherently global, but we are based in Silicon Valley, and certainly periodically we fall into that block. The element of storytelling that I want to come back to, though, is look for stories that express clarity. Resist stories that imply certainty.
Thank you. Let's see. We've got some industry-specific questions that I wanted to bring up. So one in particular, amid the pandemic, one of the more, I guess, certainly one that could have been anticipated is the impact on our supply chain, on manufacturing, on things that, of course, can't convert to remote work. And so I know that that's part of the conversation in the post-COVID world, is how things will become more distributed. But what about industries where that's not going to be possible, or at least not possible probably on a 10, 20-year time horizon? How can they be thinking about navigating this issue of certainty and clarity in light of those physical constraints that they face?
Right. So again, good question. So another one of the core forecasts that I believe in to be true, even in the VUCA world, is anything that can be distributed will be distributed. So there's just an inevitability about a more distributed world, and the COVID virus and the sheltering in place has accelerated that, but it was there before. And it goes back to the roots of the internet. I got involved in the internet when I first joined the Institute in the 1970s. And, the internet started in 1968 and was publicly introduced in 72. And one of the engineers developing the core technology was one of our founders, Paul Barron. And what he developed was the core technology of packet switching, which is to create the internet, which is still the core technology going forward, to create an environment, a network, which has no center, grows from the edges, can't be controlled. And his assignment was to develop a network that would resist nuclear attack. So it had to be robust. So what came out of that, that came to be called packet switching. But Paul's original term for it was hot potato rooting. Hot potato rooting.
Amazing.
So again, anything that can be distributed will be distributed, and that's going to continue. But you're right. Some forms of manufacturing, some forms of service, some forms of experience can't be distributed. So anything that can will, the costs will go down. And the next generation I talk in the new book about distributed authority computing, where traditional computing had centralized authority. If you think about the next versions of blockchain, the next versions of distributed authority computing, those are essentially going to have authority that's distributed across larger spaces. And then you bring in things like 3D printing and kind of local sourced ways of taking core elements and then magnifying and localizing. Those tools are going to get dramatically better. So the overall forecast is anything that can be distributed will be distributed, but it's going to vary a lot depending on the industry and depending on the age. And the region.
Wonderful. I'm just trying to find a good closing question because this has flown by.
Well, you're
And
doing a
all
great
of
job of filtering and curating, though.
how about it just in terms of closing out, like what are some, knowing that our sort of information ecology is so chaotic and sort of thinks this person used the word polluted even, I think which is justifiable. What are some processes that we can, now that we have a bit of this world pause, use to move us towards clarity now to be ready for what's coming, the sort of next stage of this crisis? So
Yeah,
I know we have stories, but are there other ways in which maybe we could be asking better questions, like connecting with people who aren't in Generations from Mars? Like, what are some strategies we could think
right.
about?
Okay, so I'm going to get personal now and make some personal advice suggestions. I think you can apply future back to yourself. So think about yourself aged 10 years. And depending on how old you are, you can go further, 20, 30, whatever. If you have kids or you have family, think of them aged 10 years. And, in our work in Foresight Essentials, we keep reminding ourselves that we're not very good at thinking of ourselves as aged or ourselves future back. So that's the beginning. The present is too noisy. It's too noisy. So we have to think future back. So think future back. Then cross-generational mentoring, the single most important thing we can do. Pretty much every team at the Institute for the Future is cross-generational. I've learned so much by working with people much younger than I am. If you're lucky enough to have kids that are home now, it's a great opportunity for reverse mentoring. And I know it's tough, and it's easy for me to say that, but you have this great opportunity to learn from your kids, and you're in an immersive learning environment, whether you like it or not. It's forced. So figure out a way to think future back, figure out a way to do cross-generational learning, let's say, where we're not just mentoring our kids and our grandkids, we're learning from those kids. And I want to end on an optimistic note too. I think full spectrum thinking does give us that ability to seek our clarity, to think foresight, insight, action, to seek our clarity, and resist those stories of certainty all around us. So stay away from the people who are stuck in certainty, whatever the certainty is. Even if you agree with it, stay away from it. It's toxic in these times. Seek out clarity, but resist certainty. And people often ask me, am I concerned about growing political certainty around the world? And yeah, I'm concerned, but I don't think it's scalable. I think if you go back to this principle, which I really believe anything that can be distributed will be distributed. If you have a political leader who comes in with a simplistic promise of certainty, or a religious leader who comes in with a simplistic promise of certainty, it'll work in the short term because so many people are so confused and they really want certainty, but it won't scale. It won't scale because anything that can be distributed will be distributed. Now, there are debates about this. When I teach at the Army War College, Madeleine Albright is often the person following me, and she's got this wonderful new book about fascism, a warning. And I have great respect for her, and I listen to her point of view. But I think anything that can be distributed will be distributed. I think full spectrum thinking will grow as we think 10 years ahead, as the tools grow and the need increases. And I don't think the more simplistic categorizing, the more simplistic certainty, I just don't think it's scalable in this future. So I'd like to leave you with that thought, leave you with that hope.
Thank you for leaving us with more hope. No, we are right up on time, so I just want to close things out. Thank you, all of you, for taking time to join us, literally from all over the world. I saw India, I've seen all over the United States, Spain, And we really, truly appreciate it. And I hope that you will go and buy Bob's book to learn more about full spectrum thinking and bring that into your life and your communities and your organizations. Again, this is hosted by IFTF Vantage, our organizational partnership program, but IFTF offers trainings, and like much of the world, we used to do more in-person events, and we are now moving to more digital offerings. So this is from our Foresight Essentials team, which offers online learning now through our Foresight for Business program. Many of you may have come from Jane McGonigal's Coursera course also that's available to you. We have a 5-course specialization on futures thinking on Coursera, and then we also have this option here supported with IFTF researchers as well, going through that so that you can use more of this futures thinking and full spectrum thinking, again, in your own lives, your own organizations, and your own communities. And with that, if you would like to follow up and connect with either Bob or myself, please feel free to reach out. And thank you again for joining us. I think a lot of you asked about the recording, so I want to share this verbally rather. We were recording this, and this will be posted online for you to rewatch again. And also, please share this with other people who you think would benefit from this mode of thinking, more full spectrum thinking, more futures thinking, because again, we believe that this is all a way for us to have more hope, both in the present and in the future. With that, I want to thank Bob again for being so generous with your time, and we will see you on our next session of Ask a Futurist later.